A quiet, forgotten corner of the city. The wind tears the last leaves from the trees, and they fall to the ground like crumpled thoughts. Here in the park, where time flows slowly and the air seems filled with expectation, it would seem that nothing should disturb the peaceful atmosphere. But it is here, in this moment, that two worlds will collide, the world of the old woman and the world of the teenager living on the edge. She sat on the bench, alone. Her face was hidden by her glasses, but her eyes, calm and penetrating, could see far more than anyone would have expected. She was alone, but not lonely. Silently, with a slight smile, she watched the world around her, the same leaves that fell to the ground, and the people who passed by without a care in the world. Everything was peaceful. Everything was familiar. Until that moment. He came out of nowhere, a teenager in a sports jacket, with his hood pulled up so that only his eyes could see the world around him. He paced quickly, with the look of a man who knew what he needed and where he was going. His gaze was cold, determined, full of indifference to everything around him. But he slowed his step when he noticed a woman. She was sitting on a bench, oblivious to what was going on around her, as if everything was fine. But he knew this would be his chance. Stopping a step, he eyed her, appraising her. An older woman, alone, in the middle of the park, was the perfect victim to get some easy money. He didn't think about what could go wrong. He didn't think about who she might have been or what circumstances had brought her here. He only thought about how to get what he needed quickly and painlessly. He stepped closer, his heart beating faster. He knew he would have power in his hands, power over her fears. He just had to scare her. But as he was about to approach, suddenly something in her posture made him stop. She didn't lift her head. She continued to sit as if she hadn't noticed his approach. But there was something lurking in her shadow. An elusive something. She didn't look frightened. The teenager stepped forward, confidently, as if each step had been calculated in advance. But then, his voice sounded shrill, loud as a punch. "You! Give me the money. Quickly." His tone was harsh, aggressive, as if he were ready to punish any slowness. The woman didn't move. She just looked at him through her glasses, and for a moment there was silence between them. The silence was heavy, its tension felt in every cell of his body. He couldn't understand why she wasn't scared, why she didn't run or scream. All his training, his confidence in his abilities, it was all starting to lose meaning. Then he took the knife he'd been hiding in his pocket and slowly drew it out, feeling the cold steel slide pleasantly down his arm. He stepped closer, now threateningly, intending to make one last thrust. But she didn't move. "Can't you hear me?" His voice was getting harsher and harsher. "Give me the money." And then, as his patience began to run out, something happened that made his blood run cold. The woman raised her hand, unhurriedly, as if silently signaling him to stop. She showed no fear, no panic. Only a look full of awareness and precision suddenly caught him like a knife's edge. He froze. Something was wrong. But he still didn't know what it was. The teenager stood a few steps away from the woman, his heart pounding frantically. He couldn't understand why she didn't show the slightest fear. The whole world around him seemed to have become frozen. He could feel the cold sweat protruding on his forehead, but despite that, his lust for easy gain was stronger. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a way for him to win. To win over all those dumb old people, the blacks, as he sometimes thought of them, sitting in the parks, waiting to die, afraid to go out into the world. He had long ago learned to look at people as objects to be used. But this woman, she was different. Not scared, not weak. He'd thought her age was his chance, but now he doubted his plan would work. His brain was still buzzing with thoughts on how to make the most of this situation. Give her what she wants and you'll get what you need, an idea occurred to him. He moved closer again, feeling the tension tearing through his body, but there was a fierce fire burning in his eyes now. "You can't run away, you can't hide. You're just a weak old woman, he thought, counting on her fear to bring her into submission after all. Didn't you hear me? His voice was loud again, almost shrill. Put the money on the ground. I won't say it again. She sat there, unmoving. He brought the knife up to her face, his hand trembling with nerves, but he quickly tightened his fingers around the handle, reminding himself that he wasn't just a teenager, but someone who could control this situation. He knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. At that moment, his eyes noticed her hand, clenched into a fist, resting on his knee. The woman wasn't paying attention to him, but something in her posture, in her confidence, as if there was a hidden potential lurking in her body, made his heart quicken for a moment. He looked at her more closely and suddenly realized she wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid because she'd seen far worse than he'd ever imagined. He took a step forward, now quite close. He could smell her skin. She smelled tart and old, an odor that for some reason irritated him. Why should he be afraid of this woman? Why does she sit there and do nothing? You think I'm weak, old lady? He said it as if his words were a weapon. Words that were meant to pierce her composure. His smile was mocking, even derisive. But in the back of his mind, something began to stir, a feeling that he was on the wrong track. His fingers clenched on the hilt of the knife. He didn't want this, but he had no choice. The money. This was his chance. He couldn't let some woman, some old woman who might not even realize she was part of what was called the world, stop him from realizing his plans. He was sure there was nothing she could do to give up. After all, what could a person who had already survived half her life do? She didn't have the strength to resist. But as soon as his hand moved forward, she raised her head sharply. Her eyes, cold and so penetrating, met his gaze. There was no fear in them. Nor was there pity. There was something much deeper, something that made him freeze. A lightning silence hung between them like an invisible wall, separating their worlds. The teen felt a chill run down his spine. You think you're going to get away with this? Her voice was low, flat, almost uninterested. But it penetrated him like the point of a knife. His face contorted, an angry irritation rising in him. Who was she to tell him that? He could have decided everything. He could have been the winner. That old woman had no right to look at him like that. You talk too much, he said with increasing contempt, but his words didn't sound so confident anymore. He was taking a step back, trying to create distance, as if he were trying to prepare for the next spurt. It wasn't going to be a protracted one, she had to give in. But now he knew he was wrong. She wasn't just sitting on the bench, not just reliving this moment. She was watching him. She was waiting. And he, without realizing it, was getting deeper and deeper into the trap he'd fallen into, not knowing that his plan no longer mattered. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, whether you had similar moments in your life. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new stories. We continue. The teenager stood in front of the woman as if in front of a map with a clear but distant path. He was sure she wouldn't dare resist, wouldn't dare do anything. Everything was in his hands. The knife was raised. He saw her eyes widen slightly, as if she realized the threat, but she didn't move, didn't try to run away, didn't scream. Instead, her gaze became even sharper, even harder, as if she was searching his eyes for something. She's afraid, he thought, convinced that her silence was fear. After all, what could she do? She's old. She is weak. What could she counter his determination? He felt his harassment grow more confident, more aggressive as he raised the knife a little higher. Almost with relish, he prepared to make one last move to end her resistance, seize her money and walk away, leaving her with the thought that she was but a helpless woman. But something in her eyes suddenly changed. What he had taken for fear turned out to be something else. The woman was still sitting on the bench, but now her eyes weren't just calm. They were like two dark lights that were watching him, as if every move he made, every intention he had, she could see right through him. There was no panic in her gaze. There was no pity. There was no fear. "Can't you hear me?" he said again with a sneer, dismissively. "I said give me the money. Quickly." He took a step forward, feeling his aggression flaring. But the woman didn't move. She continued to stare at him, her gaze becoming more and more penetrating, almost probing, as if she were studying not only him but his very soul. The teen gritted her teeth, bringing the knife even closer to her face. This was supposed to be over quickly. It was supposed to be so simple. He expected her to start sobbing now, for her to slip away from her fear into some pathetic defenselessness. But none of that was happening. Then his patience broke. He stepped forward with brute force, almost forcing her backward. His eyes flashed with fierce fire, and his voice became shrill and harsh. "Don't you realize I'm sick of you? I'm not kidding. You could die if you don't give up everything you have." But her reaction shocked him. The woman raised her hand, unhurriedly, as if there was no tension. As if she wasn't facing a life-threatening threat. She leaned back against her bench, her body as straight as a tree trunk. The teenager froze, not realizing what she was doing. And then something happened that was imprinted in his memory like a thunderclap. The woman rose slowly, with dignity, taking her time getting to her feet. He felt his confidence shake, as if he were facing something far more formidable than a knife. "You threaten me," she said, her voice cold-blooded, with no reserve of pity, "but you don't realize who you're dealing with." He was stunned, his eyes narrowed. She was not afraid. The woman stood before him, not trembling, not trying to give up. There was something frightening in her calmness. It wasn't fear. It was knowledge. He took a step back, but his step was no longer so sure. His mind was trying to understand what was going on, that his plan suddenly didn't work. And suddenly he realized that it wasn't just an old woman standing in front of him, but someone who saw life from a completely different angle. "You think I'm just going to give up?" Her words were cold and direct. She wasn't asking. She was asserting. "You're wrong." The teenager couldn't believe this was happening. He was prepared for this outcome, but not in this execution. His shoulders tensed and he clenched the knife in his hands again, trying to regain control of the situation. He had to scare her. He had to win. His aggression rolled again, but she remained unfazed. Now he was beginning to have doubts. Anxiety was growing in him with every passing moment, but he couldn't back down. He was already so close. Then her gaze sank back into his like a knife in his back, and his body felt as if it had frozen. "Are you trying to scare me?" she said quietly. "You don't even know what you're doing here right now." His heart skipped a beat. This woman was no longer just a target. She had become an unimaginable threat, one he didn't know, couldn't imagine. And this moment of fear, this realization that he was no longer in control, was only the beginning of what was to come. The teenager felt his breathing becoming heavy. Everything he had done up to this point was losing its effectiveness. The woman stood in front of him, but her gaze was calm, as if everything going on around her didn't matter. Her silence was not weakness. It was far more dangerous. He couldn't understand why she was acting this way, but something in her confidence frightened him more than any threat. He looked at the knife in his hand again. He thought that this particular knife was supposed to be the solution, that this was going to be his last step in this little war. He was supposed to scare her before she had time to realize what was happening. But now something was different. He could feel the situation drifting away from him as the sand slid between his fingers. The woman continued to stand still, her arms relaxed and her face expressing no fear or emotion. Everything in her demeanor told him she was different. She didn't have what the teenager expected from people in his power, panic. The exact same panic he'd seen before, in the eyes of other victims. He'd always known that even the strongest people would break at some point. But not her. Her eyes, seemingly ordinary at first glance, now seemed very strange. The teenager gripped the knife even tighter, trying to force himself to move. He took a step back, stepping into his fear again. He knew he couldn't leave empty-handed. But his anger became uncertain again. He couldn't just attack without knowing what would happen next. The woman took a step toward him, calmly and slowly, without haste, but her movement was decisive. She didn't try to close herself off or protect herself like the others did when there was a knife in front of them. She moved as if her life didn't depend on what was happening here and now. The teenager froze. Each step the woman took filled him head over heels with a sense of growing fear he couldn't explain to himself. He was expecting her to scream or beg like everyone else right now. He was even prepared to intimidate her even more. But her resolve was far stronger. "What do you want from me, boy?" she asked suddenly, her voice flat, without any aggression. But it wasn't a request, not a question. It was a statement, as if she already knew the answer. The teen tried to take a step forward again, but her eyes pierced him. He felt his confidence shake again. Not her gaze. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't threatening. She was just watching. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like someone who had been through far more than he could ever imagine. He tried to get the situation back under control. He took another step toward her, almost forcing himself to move. But the woman, as if anticipating his movements, stood a little higher, right in front of him, her eyes still sliding over his movements, assessing each one. "Are you threatening me with something?" Her question was quiet, almost indistinguishable, but there was something in it that made his blood run cold. He felt her calmness transfer to him. She knew exactly how to make him doubt. The teen noticed her hand move slightly to the purse she held next to her. He instantly tensed up, ready for any movement. He was sure she would either pull out something for her defense or start running. But the woman did neither. "Do you think I'm scared?" Her question was more of an observation than a request. "Are you sure I can't stand up for myself?" His breathing became confused. He stood in front of her, knife in hand, and realized he was not in control. It was horrible. He was younger than her. He was stronger than her. But, for some strange reason, she was still the one setting the terms. He looked around, but something about her presence made him look at her again. And he realized that she wasn't holding herself back because she was afraid. She was holding herself back because her life had been full of surprises. Because there were shadows in her past that he couldn't even imagine. And that scares him. "You're playing a dangerous game," her voice cut through the silence again, its harshness reaching the teenager's ears like a punch to the gut. "But not all games end with you winning." It was a threat, but not the threat he had expected. Was this woman sitting in front of him just old and helpless? Or was she not just a victim, but something far more sinister? The teen was no longer confident in his abilities. The tension that grew with every move she made was leaking out onto his face. He was here, knife in hand, but all his instincts were screaming at him to back off. The teenager stood on the brink of despair. He knew he had to act without letting this woman get the upper hand. He clenched the knife in his hand, feeling the metal handle chill his fingers. She stood before him, unwavering, and there was no sign of fear, no hint of submission. He was used to people he threatened starting to twitch, to back away, to beg for mercy. It was like a predictable reaction, nothing more. But she wasn't flinching. She didn't scream. She didn't throw herself into a stampede. She stood there, staring at him with that cold stare, as if she was waiting for him to just disappear. And it was beginning to displease him. Every word he spoke was an empty echo in his head. He kept threatening, kept taking steps forward, but with each movement he felt the confidence melt away. His words were beginning to lose power, as if they couldn't reach her, as if she was out of reach. She wasn't afraid. She didn't even look scared. Why isn't she reacting? The teenager asked himself, feeling his pride slowly turning to irritation. He was used to people being afraid of him. He was used to any move he made causing panic. But she didn't seem to be like the rest of them. The woman didn't seem like someone who could be frightened. She was quiet, but her silence wasn't weakness, it was something far more dangerous. He took another step, confidently pointing the knife at her face, but her gaze stayed on him again. Those eyes left no room for doubt. They saw right through him, as if they were saying, "I've already studied you." The teenager felt his confidence begin to dissipate again, but he couldn't back down. He couldn't show weakness. He couldn't let himself lose. "I said, give me the money." This time his voice was almost a shout. But, instead of giving in to his threats, the woman only tilted her head slightly, as if she was assessing him as a strange man trying to prove his authority. He remembered how all the other victims had quickly given up when he threatened them. He'd never encountered anything like this before. Why isn't she afraid? Why doesn't she see that he could be dangerous? Uncertainty began to grow inside him, and though his pride wouldn't let him back down, fear slowly but surely crept into his heart. His breathing became heavy, his body tensed. He knew now that she wasn't just an old woman he could easily fool. She was something else. Something lurked behind her calmness. He felt that at this point, he probably should have backed off. But something inside wouldn't let him give up. He couldn't afford to lose. He was a man, even if a woman stood before him. "You think I'll just give up if you scare me with a knife?" Her voice was low and flat as metal. "Are you trying to destroy me? Do you think you can easily take my possessions?" He was stunned. She spoke to him as if she were not an old woman, but an equal to himself. She wasn't talking to him as if he were a victim, not running away, not escaping. She was challenging him to a fight, as if she knew there was nothing he could do to her. And it made him angry. It pissed him off. "Don't you get it at all? I'm not kidding." The teenager stepped forward again, but his step was tentative. He could feel his legs growing heavy, his throat growing dry. He tried to regain control, but his inner confidence began to crumble. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The woman, meanwhile, made no unnecessary movement. She stood still, her eyes never leaving his. She studied him as if he were just some piece of the puzzle she needed to solve. There was no fear or pity in her gaze. She knew her calmness was her weapon. "You don't understand anything at all, boy." Her words didn't sound threatening, but there was something scary about them. "You expect me to beg you for something? But you don't know who you're dealing with. You think I'm afraid of what you might do? I've been through far worse things than you can imagine." His body tensed. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know how to act. His whole life had been full of struggle, full of striving to stay one step ahead of everyone else. But now he found himself in front of a woman who knew how not to give up. And that fact made him uneasy. He felt that his strength, his influence, his aggression was not working. He was standing in front of a woman who was just waiting for him to realize that she was no longer just a victim. And that feeling of things being out of his control filled him with fear. But worst of all, he couldn't back down. At that moment, everything came to a standstill. The teenager, still holding the knife in his hand, stood as if frozen, but not because he was frightened. On the contrary, he was trying to control the situation. He could feel how every glance she gave him was driving him deeper into uncertainty. But here she was, the woman, suddenly doing something completely unexpected. She stood up from the bench. The movement was so smooth, so confident, that his blood instantly froze in his veins. She rose slowly, but her every step was so deliberate that the teenager felt the air around him become dense, as if everything around them had suddenly shrunk. The teenager clenched the knife. He tried to look into her face, but it was hard, her eyes, his gaze. Those eyes, they expressed neither fear nor pity. On the contrary, there was something deep in her gaze, something that made his heart beat faster. His intuition told him that she wasn't going to run away. She wasn't going to be a victim. A wave of fear was building inside him that he didn't know how to handle. The woman stood up, not moving quickly, not hurriedly. There was not the slightest sign of panic or tension in her body. It was a calmness. It was tension in his own body, because every step she took, every detail, every glance seemed a challenge he didn't know how to take. He took a step back, but his legs didn't seem to obey. He felt for himself how he might no longer be in control of the situation. Must act. He thought, but anxiety was growing in his mind. The teenager couldn't understand what was going on. The woman, the old woman who had just sat in front of him, was now on her feet, and her body was like a fortress despite her age. She stood straight, straightening her back as if her years didn't matter. Her gray hair and her frail body didn't matter. She was what he lacked: experience, strategy, confidence. "Do you think I'm afraid?" Her voice was even and, despite the tension of the situation, almost calm and steady. The teenager felt his legs shake, and his hands holding the knife began to tremble. That voice, calm and confident, was like a punch in the gut to him. He stepped closer again, but he intuitively felt he was making a huge mistake. He didn't know what she was going to do, but her abrupt change in posture, her confidence told him that this wasn't just any old woman who would beg for mercy in fear. This was not her role in this game. "You don't realize who you're dealing with," she continued, as if she hadn't heard his threats. "You thought I was going to beg you, thought you were scaring me. But you were wrong. You just didn't know who was standing in front of you." The teen felt his stomach clench with fear as the woman took another step in his direction. He took a step back again, trying to regain control, but his body, his instincts, all those years of thinking he could always win, were now in question. Why isn't she backing away? Why isn't she screaming, begging? Why doesn't she tremble before his knife? The woman took her time, but her movements were precise, like a predator studying its prey, taking her time, realizing that everything had already been decided. He still couldn't figure out what she wanted. She wasn't trying to hide. She didn't try to pretend she didn't see the threat. She was like a wall he was crashing against. Thoughts began to swirl in his head. Why isn't she afraid? Why is she so sure? This is no ordinary old woman. This isn't just a grandmother in the park. She's seen this before. She's been through more than I'll ever realize. His own fears began to eat away at his confidence. He tried to regain control, but her calmness was ruining his plans. "Do you want me to give up?" She continued, as if asking for the record, but her words sounded like a sentence. "You thought you could control everything. You didn't know who I was, did you?" He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. The woman stepped even closer. He felt his heart pounding faster and faster, the blood rushing through his veins. He stood in front of her, knife in hand, but his hands were now unsure. He realized he was making a big mistake. But pride, his inner sense of superiority, kept him from backing down. The woman took the final step. The teenager instinctively swung the knife. But she did not retreat. On the contrary, her eyes glistened, and there was something in her movement that made his heart sink. At that moment he realized that she had already done everything she needed to do. Let's take another quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you had moments in your life that resemble what's happening in this story? Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new developments. We continue. The teenager continued to stand in front of the woman, his fingers clutching the hilt of the knife, his breathing becoming more and more confused. He was certain that everything now depended on his strength. He didn't think about her, didn't consider that her calmness might hide something much deeper. He was too preoccupied with his anger, his desire to show who was in charge. To him, she was just another victim, another old woman he could dictate his terms to. He was sure her years and appearance meant she couldn't be a threat. "Do you think I'm afraid of you?" Her voice, still calm, with a slight tinge of mockery, pierced him. She didn't try to run away, didn't try to resist. She just stood there, and her words cut through the fog of his self-confidence like a knife. But the teenager didn't give up. He still held the knife, which meant he was in control. "You're going to regret touching me, old woman." His words came out with an effort, fury, contempt, racial hatred. He thought he would break her with it. But she only grinned softly, her face cold, her eyes showing neither fear nor compassion. She suddenly spoke again, her voice quiet but unrelenting. "You think you're the only one who can threaten me with a knife? You want me to tremble in fear of you like everyone else? But you're wrong. You don't know who you're dealing with." The teenager didn't understand. He stood in front of her, ready for the next step, but his intuition, his senses began to change him. He could feel the fog of fear growing inside him, despite his outwardly confident demeanor. She spoke to him as if her experience was far more dangerous than his anger. He was sure she was nothing but a helpless old woman, and every word she said only added fuel to the fire. Her eyes never took their eyes off his. It was like a stab in the back. He could feel it. He could feel that something in her gaze didn't fit his usual frame of reference. Her calmness, it shocked him. He'd expected to see fear, a panicked look on her face when she realized he was threatening her with a knife. But her eyes, full of such confidence, as if everything he did was familiar, shattered all his hunches. He did not notice how she turned her head slightly, as if considering something within herself. And then, with the same calm determination, she said, "You don't know how quickly life can disappear, do you?" The teen felt something slide down his neck, something he couldn't think about until it was too late. The woman was talking about something profound. Not just about death, but about what she had experienced. He didn't understand it because he himself was too full of contempt, too fixated on his power and his control. He still looked at her as an object, a victim to be destroyed. But he didn't notice how her words cut through his confidence. She continued. "You can't see me, can you? You don't even see who I really am. You just want to take my money, cut me open with your knife and walk away. But you don't even realize what I could do to you if I wanted to." Those words shook the teenager. He didn't know why, but with every word she said, with every look she gave him, his confidence melted. He wanted to regain control, he tried to suppress this growing anxiety, but her words penetrated him like a knife edge and made him doubt. At that moment, something happened. He felt himself slowing down, as if something invisible was holding him back. He couldn't figure out what it was. He was sure he could win. But here she spoke again. "You underestimated me. You think I'm just an old woman, that I don't know anything, that I can't defend myself. You're wrong. You have no idea how quickly and violently your confidence can fade." The teenager wanted to approach again, to threaten again, but something in her gaze, in her tone, stopped him. He suddenly realized that he didn't see fear in her calmness. He didn't see her as just a victim. He saw something else. And images began to flash in his mind. He began to remember the words she had said, his intuition telling him that her calmness was no accident. These little details, her phrases, her meaningful movements, they weren't random. She knew what she was doing. She knew who she was. And what she had been through. But the teenager couldn't see it. He relied too much on his strength and his confidence. And she, for her part, stood, and her gaze only confirmed that she knew more than he could ever comprehend. The teenager continued to stand, clutching the knife, feeling his confidence fade as the sand slid from his hands. The woman took her time, her movements calm, but her gaze was more than just threatening now. She was what he had been so afraid of, though he hadn't realized it until now. All of her calmness, all of her words, her steadfastness, it was as if it had been stored in his mind, making him doubt himself. He felt something had changed on his horizon. He couldn't figure out what it was, but he sensed that she was hiding something that could turn the tide. He took another step forward, his foot seeming to reach for victory, but with each movement he lost his confidence. Every word she said, every look she gave him became more and more pressuring. His pride screamed at him that he was still in control, but his intuition told him he was wrong. The woman made a slight movement, her right hand slid leisurely along the purse lying nearby on the bench. The teenager noticed it, and his body tensed. He froze, figuring she was probably going to reach for a weapon or some means of self-defense. But only one thought echoed in his head: she can't. She's just an old woman. I'm still stronger than her. That feeling stayed with him even though the situation seemed increasingly unstable. The woman suddenly looked up and said, "You thought I was just an old woman, didn't you? You thought I didn't know how to do anything. You underestimated me, boy. That's your big mistake." His muscles tensed, and he felt fear begin to surge through his chest like a hot wave. Something in her voice, something in her tone, made him freeze. He looked around again, trying to find anything that could help him. But her calmness, her confidence, her gaze, it all created such a dense atmosphere that he felt like he was drowning in the sensation. And that's when she made her move. With a swiftness that the teenager barely had time to notice, she raised her hand and in the same second made a precise and confident gesture. In her hand was not a weapon, but an ordinary object, a silver penknife. It was a knife, nothing more. But its tip glinted in the light so quickly that the teenager didn't even have time to appreciate what had happened. She slid the knife down his arm, right to his wrist. It was so sudden, so lightning fast, it was as if his body didn't have time to react to that moment. In an instant, his hand holding the knife was knocked off, and the weapon flew out of his hands, falling to the ground like a superfluous part that no longer mattered. The teenager jerked back, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. His gaze was full of surprise, not pain, until he felt the blood begin to ooze from his cut. He looked at her face, calm, confident. She hadn't done anything unnecessary. All her movements were honed, and this moment that he thought would be his victory turned out to be a complete defeat. She stood in front of him, unmoving. The woman slowly put the knife away in her purse, then looked at him with an expression as if he were just a child who didn't understand what was happening. "You're always in such a hurry," she said, her voice low, tinged with understanding. "You always think that force will solve everything. But you've never learned to respect your opponent." The teenager couldn't understand what had happened. He had lost the knife. He was standing there empty-handed, and though he hadn't felt pain yet, this loss of control, this unimaginable lightning-fast reaction from the woman, it had turned his world upside down. He felt small, helpless. He, who had always thought he had enough aggression and strength, was now faced with something he hadn't expected. His chest heaving with exertion, he took a step back, but his body was weak. He looked at the woman and couldn't believe his eyes. She was so calm. It wasn't just a reaction. It was a skill that the teenager couldn't even predict. Her movements were so sure, so precise, he suddenly realized, he had never been so unprotected. "You don't understand," she continued, her eyes never letting him go. "You don't even realize what you're up against. I don't need you to be afraid, I don't need you to threaten me. All you've done is show me how much you don't understand about real power." The teenager stood there, unable to move. He stared at her face and tried to understand how this was possible. This wasn't just a woman. This was an experience. This was someone who didn't rely on external strength, but used inner confidence and knowledge to make sure she didn't make mistakes. She took a step in his direction, and in that moment, the teen realized that she was facing something that would completely ruin all of his plans. She wasn't his victim. She was his teacher. And in that moment, his thoughts went blank and his fear grew like a wave flooding everything he knew. The teenager stood there, feeling his body weaken with the realization of what had happened. His pride, his aggression, his confidence, all of it was crumbling right before his eyes. He tried to regain control, tried to take a step back, but it was as if his legs wouldn't listen. He still couldn't believe what had happened. He had lost the knife. He wasn't even able to defend himself. He thought it would be quick and easy, that he would take this woman like any other object and walk away with an easy victory. But instead he found himself in a trap he couldn't get out of. His hands began to shake, and he felt the adrenaline that had been coursing through his veins now turn to fear. His face contorted with panic. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to get out. He was used to being in control of everything, but now he found himself facing a woman who not only disarmed him, but took all of his strength from him. He wasn't sure what was going on, and that scared him even more. She stood before him, as still as a statue, her face calm and cold, without a trace of emotion. She was still by his side, her eyes never leaving his. She was no longer an object he could simply attack. She was his inevitable fate. "You don't understand, boy," her voice was quiet, but every word in it was like a blow. "You've lost. It's not just defeat. You don't even know what's happening to you." The teenager tried to take a step back, but his body wouldn't listen. He was cornered. He wanted to keep threatening, keep yelling, keep asserting his power, but there was no point. He saw her hands slowly move to the pocket of her purse, and in that moment he realized that this was where it would end. The woman pulled out a pair of handcuffs, simple, metal ones, but to him they looked like a sentence. He felt his pride slowly but inexorably fading. He tried to back away, but she was faster. As soon as he tried to move to the side, she made one sharp movement and his hands were secured in handcuffs. He didn't even have time to realize what had happened. "Did you think you could frighten me, that I would beg you?" Her words were sure, precise, as if she were repeating them memorized. She looked up at him, and there was something distant in her eyes, something that told him she had been through these moments long ago. "You were wrong, boy. You don't realize who you're playing with." The teen felt his pride crumbling, the walls of his self-confidence crumbling with every word she said. He tried to speak, but his voice was no longer as loud as it used to be. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to justify himself. "I thought you were lucky," the woman continued, tilting her head. "You think you can just go out and hurt someone because you're stronger, because you're younger. You thought it would be easy for me to give up. But here you are, and I'm in control of this situation." Her words penetrated him like an icy wind. He tried to free his hands, but the handcuffs clenched his wrists, and even if he tried to break free, it would be useless. He realized that everything he had once thought about his control was a mistake. He was small and helpless in front of this woman. Her calmness was his last game. He realized she wasn't just a woman, she was something he would never be, a man who had learned how to control his life and his emotions. She knew how to control him. She knew how to keep him in those handcuffs, how to make him realize that he wasn't as important as he thought he was. All his scorn, all his gloating was useless now. He stood, exhausted, with his arms subdued, while the woman approached him, his breathing getting faster and faster. He was trapped. He was the one who had proven to be weak. This wasn't just defeat. This was payback for his pride, for his anger, for his hatred. She looked at him like a child, and there was something in her gaze that made him feel insignificant. It was like a simple reminder, everything he'd once thought, everything he'd once felt, didn't matter. She had won. "You weren't ready." Her words were spoken so quietly that they seemed to drown in the silence around them. "You never realized who you were dealing with." And in that moment, he realized that this woman was so much more than just a victim. She was what had shattered everything he knew about himself, and now, with handcuffs on his arms, he was no longer the man he had been just a few minutes ago. Everything had changed. The teenager stood with handcuffs on his wrists, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost. All his confidence, all his aggression, everything he thought was important, now shattered. Everything he thought about his strength, his power, his right to dictate terms, was now nothing. He didn't feel like a winner. He felt like a loser, and that was worse than any defeat. He stood there, feeling his world slowly collapsing as every part of his life, every illusion of who he was, fell apart. The woman stood before him, her face calm, almost emotionless, but there was some heaviness in her eyes that he couldn't understand. She was looking at him the way one looks at a mistake that just needs to be corrected. There was no anger. There was no joy, no revenge. There was only calmness. She wasn't someone who could be defeated by force or threats. She was someone who had already seen everything, who didn't panic, who didn't believe in taking the easy way out. The teenager tried to gather his thoughts, but nothing worked. He realized that at this moment he had lost everything. His desire for easy success, his desire to take a quick buck and walk away with a victory, had led to disaster. Everything he had done, everything he had strived for, had now turned out to be a fatal mistake. He couldn't take it all back. He couldn't undo what had already happened. He stared at her calm face, not understanding how she could react so quickly, how she could take control of the situation so clearly and confidently. And in that moment he realized that she knew more than he did. She was prepared. She wasn't afraid of his threats. She didn't see him as an enemy, she only saw him as a man who didn't know what he was doing. And he realized that his fate had been sealed from the moment he'd come here with a knife in his hand. "You thought it would be resolved quickly, didn't you?" Her voice was flat, but there was an undercurrent of power in it. She wasn't asking a question, she was asserting. "You thought you could take everything effortlessly, that you could subjugate a world you didn't understand. But your mistake is that you didn't see me, you didn't see what I've been through. You didn't see in that park not just an old woman, but a person who has been through pain and suffering for a long time." The teenager didn't know what to say. The words she spoke seemed to pull all the energy out of him, all the will to fight. His pride was shattered. He couldn't look at her anymore, couldn't meet her gaze. He could feel the emptiness burning in his soul, how his actions, his violence, his racism, all the confidence he had built up over the years, were now nothing more than an illusion. Everything he'd thought about his power made no sense in this moment. In this world she had shown him, he was nothing. She stepped a little closer to him, and he felt her presence as something unbearable. He was restrained, he was on the verge of breaking, and in that moment he realized that all his choices, his whole life, it was a chain of mistakes that had brought him here, in this moment, in this terrible, desperate moment. "You made your choice," the woman continued, her words as heavy as a sentence. "You chose the path that brought you here. You chose the path of violence, of humiliation, of racism. And now you must realize that this path will not lead to victory. It will lead to losing everything." His mind whirled. He tried to understand what she meant, but her words, her look, they left no room for doubt. He was standing here, with handcuffs on his hands, and his life as he knew it was over. He was no longer the teenager who could scare, who could threaten. He was nothing. "You understand now," she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just a statement of fact. "You can't get it all back. You lost your chance when you decided that the world would be under you, when you decided that you would run it." The teenager felt his inner world crumbling. Everything he wanted was destroyed. His desire for easy success had turned into a complete disaster. He didn't know how to react. He didn't know what to say. He was consumed by this terrible realization that he couldn't change anything. The woman took him by the arm and gently but firmly led him to a nearby police patrol car. The teenager made no attempt to resist. His resistance had long since faded. He was broken and his pride was gone, leaving him empty. When the handcuffs were fastened around his wrists, when he was in the car, his gaze didn't go up to the police officers, didn't meet her eyes. He stared into the void, into the realization that he had lost, that his life would never be the same again. It was a tragic outcome. In this world of violence, humiliation and racism, his fatal mistake was revealed in the most tragic colors. And he knew there was no going back. What do you think about this story? Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts are very important to us and we value each and every one of you. Write your comments, share your experiences, we really want to know what you think. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. We are always happy to see you among our viewers. Have a nice day and write in the comments the phrase, "I listened until the end," so we know that you are with us until the finale.